I would like to introduce Dr. Candace Johnson, Professor of Political Science from the University of Guelph. Candace Johnson is a political theorist with expertise in gender politics, maternity health policy, and reproductive rights. Her book, Maternal Transition, A North-South Politics of Pregnancy and Childbirth, was published by Routledge 2014 and 2016, is a comparative examination of maternal health preferences in Canada, the United States, Cuba, and Honduras, and the ways in which these preferences reflect global, regional, national, and microscolar dynamics. She has also published more widely on women in politics, healthcare policy, social rights, and Latin American politics. Her latest book, Project, is a volume of human and environmental justice in Guatemala, co-edited with Stephen Hygiene, forthcoming with the University of Toronto Press. In 2009 and again in 2017, Professor Johnson was awarded the Canadian Political Science Association Jill Victors Prize in recognition for her work on gender and politics, and she was nominated for this award on 2 other occasions. Her current research includes an examination of the global Me Too movement and a project on Canada's global maternal health commitments and practice. Candace, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yvette, for that very generous introduction. I'd also like to thank the organizers for this evening, Laura and Kayla, for inviting me here, the town of Ajax. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out to listen to the presentations and to discuss this important topic, and thanks to Sharon for getting the conversation started. For my presentation tonight, I'd like to tell 2 stories about the global Me Too movement. The first is a personal one. I was shielded from the realities of women's low status and subordination until I was in about my mid-20s. My own mother was a fiercely independent thinker whose hard work inside and outside the home sustained our family in economic and emotional terms. She never spoke of feminism nor of women's struggles as women. I had no idea that I was unequal or disadvantaged in any way until I was a graduate student in political science, trying to navigate the university as a scholar in training. During graduate school, I experienced subtle forms of harassment and subordination. One male professor suggested that one of my male colleagues should check over my work. I was consistently passed over for scholarships that were won by male students. I was brutally undermined by a female faculty member who should have been my supporter, and I observed more flagrant violations, such as older male professors having relationships, both clandestine and out in the open, with female graduate students. What at first appeared to be singular slights and violations began to reveal themselves to be patterns of gender-based subordination and sexual harassment. What at first appeared to be personal insults and nuisances, attacks on learning environments and opportunities, were revealed to be career-limiting, and for some women, career-ending attacks, strategically launched as though they had been pre-programmed to destroy us all along. The impact of the damage only became more apparent when I began to work as a junior faculty member myself, first at a university in the United States, and then at my current institution in Canada. At the university in the United States, I experienced unwanted touching by 2 of my male colleagues in the workplace. The strangeness of the incidents caused me to dismiss them, while a more senior female colleague and mentor filed a complaint on my behalf. At my current university, my story of harassment is much too long to tell here. It is mostly the story of harassment by one senior male colleague, a predator who manipulated me into meeting him for lunch off campus, and then unleashed an unyielding barrage of inappropriate comments, commentary about other female colleagues and students' clothing and appearances, along with not-so-veiled threats about what might be bad for my career if I avoided his invitations in the future. He called me on the phone after looking up my phone number in the departmental directory. He showed up at my apartment uninvited and unannounced with a bottle of champagne after finding my address through that same directory. This part of the story is just the tip of the iceberg. With the support of my colleagues, both male and female, I filed an informal complaint and the harasser was sanctioned. The Me Too movement is not itself about formal processes and sanctions. It's a movement dedicated to social justice first and foremost, and not strictly legal justice. I am in agreement with legal scholar Catherine McKinnon that the Me Too movement has done what the law could not. McKinnon explains that it is widely thought that when something is legally prohibited, it more or less stops. This may be true for exceptional acts, but it is not true for pervasive practices like sexual harassment, including rape, that are built into structural social hierarchies. Equal pay has been the law for decades and still does not exist. Racial discrimination is nominally illegal in many forms, but is still widely practiced against people of color. If the same cultural inequalities are permitted to operate in law as in the behavior the law prohibits, equalizing attempts such as sexual harassment law will be systemically resisted. This logjam, which has long paralyzed effective legal recourse for sexual harassment, is finally being broken. Structural misogyny, along with sexualized racism and class inequalities, is being publicly and pervasively challenged by women's voices. The difference is power is paying attention. In my own case, the existence of clear policies and mechanisms for redress enabled alternate informal avenues for complaint. With the Me Too movement, space is created not just for alternate avenues, but for an alternate universe that creates informal venues for the simultaneous expression of individual stories. It is the multiplication of voices that amplifies the claims of harassment and abuse. And this amplification has lent credibility to women's stories of their own experiences, which have tended to be disbelieved or dismissed. Professor McKinnon had conducted her own research on university campuses and found that women are not believed about sexual harassment or assault claims until at least 4 to 5 other women make similar complaints about the same individual perpetrator. I think we're at the right slide. When I first heard about the Me Too movement in the fall of 2017, I was exhilarated. I felt like we were on the threshold of a cultural reckoning that was long overdue. The toppling of well-known public figures like Harvey Weinstein, with repeated accounts of outrageous behavior, exposed those who existed in workplaces everywhere. Me Too has publicly shamed and sanctioned powerful men in the United States: Harvey Weinstein, Les Moonves, Louis C.K., Charlie Rose, Matt Lauer, Kevin Spacey, Larry Nassar, the U.S. gymnastics team doctor, and provides important support for claimants in the cases of Bill Cosby, which had been underway prior to Alyssa Milano's call to action on October 15, 2017. It also provides support to women who are not involved in culture-bearing cases, but are trying to navigate hostile and/or sexualized spaces that diminish their social and professional worth. In Canada, Me Too is a movement, as it is in the United States, that calls attention to sexual harassment and abuse. Me Too frames the abuses of high-profile individuals like Jian Ghomeshi, Jacob Hogarth of the rock band Headley, and important institutions like the Canadian military, Parliament, universities, and the arts. So the second story that I'm telling is one about the predictable, sustained subordination of women through sexual violence. Each individual tweet, each individual story is part of a constellation of harassment and abuse that signals and reinforces women's subordination in virtually all areas of life: social clubs, schools, universities, the workplace, and institutions of government. As Catherine McKinnon's quote demonstrates, women experience inequality in many forms. According to Statistics Canada, women make 87 cents for every dollar made by a man. The gender pay gap is nothing new. It is documentation of the persistent discrimination and disadvantage for women. The same agency, Statistics Canada, also reports that women do roughly double the number of unpaid hours of childcare in the household and 1.5 times as much unpaid housework. Women also have, on average, more years of formal education than men, but this does not translate in most sectors into senior positions or equal patterns of workforce participation. According to Catalyst.org, only 7 of the 249 companies listed on the main index of the Toronto Stock Exchange in September 2017 were run by women. This is less than 0.5% or 0.5%. Women account for only 88 seats in the 338-seat House of Commons. That's 26%. And in Canadian universities, women account for only 28% of all faculty members at the rank of full professor. And as we know from a variety of sources and from the Me Too revelations, women are routinely harassed, even when there are clear policies in place to prohibit harassment, while they acquire more years of education, while they're working at lower levels and across all levels for lower pay, while doing a disproportionate amount of unpaid care work and housework at home. The corresponding hashtag Time's Up, which is focused primarily on legal justice, needs no explanation in the context of this evidence. Me Too is extraordinary because it creates new patterns, global constellations of emotions, such as anger, rage, frustration, hope, that generate affective solidarity. Each point in the constellation is significant in questioning dominant cultural patterns, namely the manifestation of patriarchal culture in schools, workplaces, communities, and political institutions at all levels. The global Me Too movement draws on existing movements in many different places, such as Iran, Nigeria, and India, and provides additional political and social currency for women's claims of gender injustice, while also providing a virtual venue for the multi-level, global, regional, national, and local enterprise of denouncing injustice in its many forms. In Argentina, the Ni Una Menos movement, which in Spanish means not one woman less, began with a series of national anti-violence marches in June 2015 to protest femicide, the killing of women simply because they are women. According to Ni Una Menos organizers, in Argentina there's a woman killed every 30 hours as a result of gender-based aversion, related, for example, to domestic violence and gender transgressions. The United Nations agency, UN Women, reports that among the 25 countries with the highest rates of femicide in the world, 14 are from Latin America and the Caribbean. In many countries, murder rates are not disaggregated by sex, but the picture comes into focus through a range of related indicators. According to the same UN Women report, and this is a lengthy quote, gender-related killings are the last act, a culmination in a series of violent acts. People often fail to recognize the deadly chain of events that lead to femicide. An abusive relationship doesn't start with murder, but the abuse escalates, and without timely intervention and support, the women may end up murdered. In Latin America, we have a culture of high tolerance towards violence against women and girls. You see it in the media all the time. Crimes against women are exhibited with very crude images, and nobody seems to care about it. Violence becomes normalized. It is seen as part of life for women. In some countries of the region, the domestic violence rates are as high as 50%. But violence against women also happens on the bus, in the streets, and in the workplace. We know that women often do not report violence, but even when they do, many crimes against women are not thoroughly investigated. Worldwide, almost 1 in 2 murdered women was killed by her partner or ex-partner in 2012. The ratio is 1 in 20 for men. United Nations initiatives, including the adoption of a protocol in developing specialized legislation to deal with femicide, with the participation of representatives from 16 different countries, have declared femicide to be linked to the low status of women in society and hatred towards women. In those 16 countries that signed on to the protocol, including Argentina, there are formal international guidelines for developing solutions to the problem of femicide. In Argentina, the birthplace of the Ni Una Menos movement, there are laws in place to address the problem of femicide, and the government has created a special office to deal with the broader problem of violence against women. A recent article explains that, with regard to women's rights, Argentina can boast comprehensive legislation as a result of either the passing of internal laws or the ratification of international treaties. This legislative inflation, however, has not been accompanied by sufficient funding for policies, making them and the whole system inefficient and ineffective. In other words, these formal measures have not yet anyway brought about a reduction in the rates of femicide or violence against women. The Ni Una Menos movement does what the Me Too movement does in the context of gender injustice. It allows for the global amplification of multiple voices that are empowering for women and compel their audiences to listen. In this way, laws governing sexual violence, femicide, sexual harassment, and abuse are not the only levers for the powerless to exercise power. The powerless can now raise their voices with public authority and do not have to rely on formal processes and venues. I've described the global Me Too movement as a cultural reckoning in broad terms and a beacon of hope for the powerless. I've not discussed backlash, which takes at least two forms. The first occurs in the form of violent reprisals. In Argentina, Ni Una Menos activist Micaela Garcia was assassinated in April 2017. She was 21 years old, an outspoken advocate for gender justice, and was raped and murdered by a man who had already been convicted of raping two other women. The other form of backlash comes in the form of concern for the male so-called victims of potential false accusations. False allegations of sexual violence are themselves a form of violence and should not be tolerated or encouraged. But that this potential error should call the Me Too movement for gender justice into question is seriously disheartening. The question about possible false allegations asks, what about the men? Me Too, for the most part, is about the women and their experiences as global sexual subordinates. I borrow from critical theorist Gayatri Spivak, who says that men and others on their behalf who feel aggrieved by being silenced, accused, questioned, made uncomfortable, or confused should feel angry at their experience of injustice, but they should not be angry with the individual women who have come forward to file a complaint or post an experience at #MeToo. They should instead be angry that history has given them such a demeaning and oppressive script from which to read and act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Candace. Sexual harassment and assault is evidently not confined to North America. Is a hashtag enough? Does a hashtag translate on a global scale? Or do other communities need something different? And what would that look like?
That's loud enough. That's a good question. Of course, the hashtag is not enough, but I think that it is exciting that it has generated as much interest and enthusiasm as it has. It's generated all kinds of other emotions as well, rage and connection. So while it's not sufficient, I think that it can contribute a lot of momentum toward cultural change, which, as Sharon was saying, is something that is critical in making much larger changes in the law and in the treatment of women and men who are also victimized. Although in this debate we're mostly talking about experiences of women. I was going to say something else, but I've lost my train of thought, which is definitely a
Well, and I think it's
hazard of the
brought
job.
an audience here today to have that conversation, to start the conversation and to address those issues. So thank you.